Thank you all for coming tonight. I am really, really happy that we can host such an incredible event with two of the very finest minds this country has to offer. The person I'll be speaking to first, Jo Quinn, and the person that Ash Sark will be speaking to, William Dalrymple, I think are the best of Britain. They're thoughtful, intelligent, cosmopolitan, kind, and progressive. And they're the exact kind of thought leaders, forgive me for that term, that we need in this country if we want to go in a better direction and have better days ahead. Jo Quinn is the Professor of Ancient History at Cambridge. She's the first woman to hold that position. She's an incredible person. Ash was talking to her about shag, kill, marry, Constantine, Trajan, and I don't know, somebody else, Augustus, and she gave a really good answer. You know, not many historians of antiquity are necessarily going to do that. Her latest book, her most recent book, How the World Made the West, I think is a must-read. An extraordinary overview of 4,000 years of history. Really undoes a lot of the shibboleths that are core to ultra-nationalist, right-wing and reactionary thinking. So with no further ado, please welcome Jo Quinn. Thank you so much. I'm loving this soundtrack.
I know, it's great. I've never had such exciting music to go on to before.
As I said a moment ago, you hold the Professorship of Ancient History at Cambridge. You started in January?
January, yep.
So maybe some people aren't going to like this, but you're kind of aligned with a certain Boris de Pfeffel Johnson because you think more kids should learn classics.
Oh, I do.
Explain why.
Yes, I do. Well, I think two different things. I think one thing is that I think everyone should learn more ancient languages, whether that's Greek or Latin or Akkadian or Sanskrit or just really interesting, difficult languages that you don't have to talk to people in. This is where, I mean, people like me, you know, I love languages. I hate talking to people. It's terrifying. And so for me, I really love languages where I don't have to learn how to ask where the station is or how to, get a latte in ancient Mesopotamia. But I can just read about people smiting each other and strange sea beasts. So that's one thing. I think everyone should learn more ancient languages, and it's really good. And if they're Latin and Greek, that's great. They don't have to be Latin and Greek, but I don't care. Difficult, interesting languages, they, develop people's brains, and they give you a different perspective on the world. And then more generally, I think people should know more about the ancient world because it's just super fun and interesting, and also because there are so many lies told about it. And Netflix can commission documentary series on aliens building the pyramids because they're massive racists. And I want to be the person who's saying that there are actually really interesting stories here, and they aren't about aliens, but they really are worth hearing. So yeah, I think more people should study classics, read about classics, listen to podcasts about classics, whatever it might be.
So I'm the Labour Secretary of State for Education. I might not have my job for much longer.
Know that.
Who knows? Who knows? I'd probably been a spot bother, wouldn't I?
Turn up for the book.
Yeah. Explain to me why kids need to drop an hour of English or French or whatever to do that hour of classics. What's the benefit to them? How's it going to help their careers, etc.?
Right. So I think there's two things. So it's going to help their careers because people who are hiring software developers, civil servants, financial analysts, one of the top degrees they like is classics, and it's the language learning side of it. It's because that really rigorous language learning that really appeals to people. But that in a way, I would like to think that people go to university for reasons other than things that are happening in the future. I'd like them to go to university for things that are happening at the same time. And to me, one of the most important things about doing ancient history, I'll say, is to learn how incredibly different people were, people could be in antiquity, to learn the ideas, modern ideas about whether it's sexuality or race or gender, all sorts of things. We might think there are a lot of different options on the table right now, but then you find out people think about it completely differently 2,000 years ago. And they think about it completely differently in Greece to the way they think about it in Mesopotamia or anywhere else. And I think there's a really, for me, the biggest thing that I got from learning about the ancient world as a student was realizing that there's no such thing as human nature, that humans can be wildly different and see the world in incredibly different ways. And I think that was immensely liberating to me as a student. And I love it when I can see my own students being liberated by that kind of realization that it's not that you just have, it's not just that you have to decide between the options that are currently on the table. It's that you can imagine totally different options and think completely differently about the world. And that to me is the biggest reason of all to study places that are very distant. And one of the most distant things you can get is the past, the distant past.
It sounds a really similar argument that's made for science fiction, right? So Kim Stanley Robinson, I believe, did a PhD in California under Frederick Jameson. Mm-hmm. And he makes this argument about science fiction being this incredibly useful genre because it opens up a set of political possibilities.
Yep.
How we recognize the moment we're all in is historically contingent. There's no essential human nature. You're making the same argument for the classics, fundamentally. It opens up the sort of horizon of possibility for human affairs.
I think I am making the same argument, but I think it's really important that these things really happened.
Yeah.
That some of the possibilities, you can say, real people really had those ideas, really saw the world that way. And it's not just that I can imagine this being the case, but that some people found that obvious. One really obvious example would be political regimes. I mean, it often seems now like you just have to agree that democracy is the only acceptable political regime, and that every other way of organizing human communities is obviously inferior to that. But actually, democracy is really unusual historically. Whether we think it's good or bad or whatever, or that maybe somebody should try it sometime, it's really historically very rare. But there are all sorts of other alternatives that people try, and some of them, are awful. Tyranny, kings, things usually go wrong there. But there are all sorts of ways of organizing communities in ways that are equal, level, voluntary, more voluntary than many democracies, that actually turn out to be much more common in human history than democracy. So to me, I mean, I think knowing more about those sorts of histories, those sorts of communities, opens up possibilities for where are we going to go from here, because we can't stay where we are.
Yeah. The classics argument against capitalist realism. Right?
Yes, exactly.
We've got Mark Fisher, Joe Quinn, Frederick Jameson. That makes sense. No, that does make sense to me. And some of the work as well of David Wangro and the late David Graeber about radical archaeology and the idea that there was a Paris commune in Mesoamerica that's completely undocumented 1,500 years ago is kind of mind-blowing. But it puts things in context.
Yeah, and I think they've done amazing work at sort of showing a real range of possibilities, even going back into very deep time in some cases. But still, these are humans. These are humans who had to face the same problem of how do you organize groups larger than immediate families, neighbors, and so on. And they found all sorts of really imaginative solutions to that. And I guess I would like to see a bit more imagination in politics. And part of freeing people up to do that is taking away the assumptions about what must be right.
You make this argument about the distinction between modern and ancient history as being kind of arbitrary and fake news. Some people say, well, ancient history ends in 1492, or, the collapse of the Eastern Roman Empire, etc., etc. You don't think there is any sort of demarcation between the two? And if there isn't, where did that come from? What purpose does it serve people to say that this is ancient history and this is modern history?
So I think, this book that came out last year, How the World Made the West, I had to decide where to finish it. I always say I wanted it to be a story about how what we now call Western civilization comes out of millennia of connections, meetings, encounters that produce new ideas and new things. And I kind of always knew that I wanted to start it in around 2500 BCE with sailing, because that's really when people start being able to communicate regularly, when they can actually get between places faster. But then I had this real problem of where do I finish it? And I had to finish it somewhere, because otherwise I think my editor would have shot me in the end. So I needed to think. So in the end, I did actually, it's interesting that you say 1492. So I did in the end think that for me, if you want to make a distinction, one distinction that you can make between what I see as a modern set of worldviews and an earlier one, not necessarily ancient, because there may be medieval historians here who wouldn't like to be, for their period to be forgotten. But I think around 1500, and to me the crucial point there is that up until then, culture has been something that brings people together. And above all, not absolutely without exception, but generally religion is something that really brings people together. That, if you're an ancient Greek merchant or an ancient Egyptian merchant, you turn up in a new port, the first thing you do is you go and visit the sanctuary of the local god or goddess, and you pay your respects and so on. And that's probably where you're going to meet the most useful people as well, to help you. And there's all these examples of religion being something people can meet and find common ground on. But then around 1500, starting a little bit earlier than that in Europe, but 1500 is when it starts being a problem for the rest of the world. You get this sort of ethnic cleansing of the Jews and the Muslims in Europe. You get the forced conversion of Atlantic peoples, first in Africa, then in particular in the Americas. And begins to be a sense that religion is something that is fundamentally divides humans, and culture more generally is something that fundamentally divides humans. And to me, that's not the only kind of line you could draw in the sand, but for me, I stopped being so interested around then, because I find it all a bit more distasteful. Not that there aren't distasteful things before 1500.
What drove that negative change? We're not, here to stand for the 13th century. Maybe you are, but what drives that change? Because I think it's Jean Baudin. For people who've not heard of Jean Baudin, why would you have heard of a sort of quite marginal? He's not marginal if you're in the history of ideas, but French legal theorist. He says that slavery had died, but in our own time we see it re-emerging again. And he's talking in precisely this era, the 1600s. And we think of slavery as this, particularly in, quote-unquote, the West, Europe, as this perennial issue, but actually it's put on steroids with the Dutch Republic, Britain, America. Yeah. It's very much coterminous, actually, with modern liberal polities. Yeah. We'll park that for a moment, but for a long stretch of medieval history, etc., actually slavery as a phenomenon was receding into the past. So why do all these things change around the 1400s, 1500s?
So, it's interesting. I think one thing is that slavery does continue for quite a long time. It is more or less continuous. If perhaps it's not
I mean in Europe. I don't mean, the
yeah,
Islamic
no,
world or
but
whatever.
even in Europe, there are sort of pockets of ongoing slavery, but it's not economically central in the way that it had been in large parts of the ancient world. Okay, I think the answer to the question of why things change, and maybe it does have to do indirectly at least with the, as it were, decline in slavery. But it's that the Western European nations, the sort of rising nations of Western Europe, England, France, Spain, Portugal, and so on, before they go into the Atlantic and exploiting the various communities there, they kind of practice in Europe, and they practice on Ireland, most famously. So I think Ireland's a sort of canary in the coal mine here, converting communities. But they also practice on Eastern Europe. And there's the whole story of the kind of late medieval conversion of Poland, Lithuania, those sorts of places that take a very long time, that convert to Christianity very late in the kind of European story. And they're not doing it, they're doing it under duress. I mean, this is the practice ground. So you see it coming certainly from the 1300s, even the 1200s. This idea that you can draw a border around a culture, and one of the easiest ways to do that is to make sure that everyone shares a religion and shares a fairly aggressive religion that isn't going to accept other religions inside it. And I think that's something that I feel like comes to a head in the 19th century with what I call in my book civilizational thinking. This idea that the word civilization is a very modern invention. It's first used in any language in the 18th century, but it's only in the 19th century that you start to get an idea of separate civilizations, separate kind of defined geographical areas that also have their own character, have their own limitations in a lot of cases. And I think that kind of thinking is the culmination of what starts in that late medieval period, but then becomes very kind of dramatic from about 1500. But is only, I think, fully theorized hundreds of years later again.
Yeah, that notion of civilizational thinking, central to the book, it's kind of like the antidote to Douglas Murray et al. Really powerful idea, I think. I love this, I don't love it because it was obviously a tragic event, but the Bronze Age collapse.
Yeah.
Explain this to me, because when you actually dig a little deeper, it kind of feels like if we do live in this world of potential climate breakdown, a world of 3, 4, then 5, then 6 degrees, if all these climate feedbacks happen, let's not go to 6, because anything with lungs won't be able to breathe. Yeah. Because the planet's, the composition of our air will have changed so much. But it feels like, as a species, we've done something similar in the past, which is the Bronze Age collapse. For people out there right now listening, watching, but also later on when this is on YouTube, explain what the Bronze Age collapse is.
Well, okay, so my take on the Bronze Age collapse is that it was really a collapse for the wealthy, above all, first of all, and above all, though it ended up affecting more people. So what this is you've got these major Bronze Age empires, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Hittites in what's now Turkey, these enormous, wealthy, powerful, tyrannical empires. Super interesting. Wonderful archaeological sites nowadays. And then you've got some sort of upstart attempts to do something similar in places like Bronze Age Greece, so Mycenae, the kind of Homeric heroes that's set in this world. And then what happens, so this goes on, these empires last in their kind of final version for a good between about 200 and 500 years, depending on the individual state. And then it all goes wrong at once. they all either completely collapse, all these major empires, or they become much, much smaller and much more isolated. And there's all sorts of theories about exactly why this happens. One possibility, one very plausible possibility, is that climate change has a lot to do with it. Another possibility is some version of pirates and bandits. This is sort of popular revolts against these kings and who run pretty exploitative agrarian regimes for their subjects. Another possibility that is just that they depend too much on each other, and this I think is the real lesson for modernity, is that once states depend too much on other states for their basic needs, then you're very vulnerable to something going wrong in that other place, or just to crazy things, to somebody deciding they want to impose tariffs all over the place in a kind of random fashion. You just become very vulnerable if you've sort of outsourced things you need to eat, and so on. So that's what happens, and then there are several centuries really where lifestyles are much simpler. There is less, never none, but less kind of international contact and trade. There's much less writing in that period, and when it comes back, it often comes back in different forms. Lots of evidence for continued storytelling. There's lots of this in Homer. The Homeric manuscript, the Homeric Greek, contains all these weird bits of really archaic kinds of Greek, when R was a vowel, that kind of thing. And they also contain kind of stories that don't make any sense in the period that they're written, which is the early first millennium BCE. Don't even make sense in the period of these great empires before it, but only really make sense a couple of hundred years earlier again. Kinds of weapons they use, the roofs that they sometimes fall off, and so on. There are these fragments from much older stories. So that to me, that was the way into thinking about this for me, is that these stories survive. So people are talking to each other, they're carrying on, remembering together, but they're no longer supplying enormous tribute and agricultural labor and military labor to these great kings. So for me, it's more of a retrenchment than a collapse for an awful lot of people who lived in the world of Western Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean at the time. But I think if you were, 90% of the people alive in that period probably would have had a better life without those kings than with them. But I think we all, what we see is the picture from the palaces and the account books and that kind of thing, and that's really what disappears. So I'm not sure. So that's to say that I'm not sure how much there really is to learn from it from the society today, because my concern is that when the states of today collapse, they're just going to take us all with them.
Yeah.
We're not going to get to go to our farms.
There's an optimistic reading, which is that actually elites have the most to gain from the perpetuation of a status quo,
Indeed.
And right now, a lot of the doomerism is, if things go really badly wrong, 2-3 degrees of warming, breakdown of global supply chains, Peter Thiel will be in his bunker in New Zealand, blah, blah, blah. We'll all be missing out, but actually maybe all these multi-billionaires will be the people who are at a comparative disadvantage to where they are today. And
yeah, it'd be nice to think that history would repeat itself in this case.
Possibly not, though.
But I worry that we're too integrated into their worlds.
Yes.
These days, that we've got all their computers and their tech gear, and that wasn't the case with Bronze Age farmers.
Maybe we'd have less YouTube and more of this.
Yeah. No, this is
seems
great.
kind of all right.
Okay, after the collapse, see you back here.
More literary festivals. William Dalrymple. I'll survive. Did they forget to write? Did the Greeks forget how to write? Was it that bad?
Okay, so most people would say they forgot how to write, or, I don't know, poverty made them a bit too stupid or something, and they could no longer write. I think they chose not to write. Because the thing is that writing is really dangerous for most people most of the time. Writing is how you get taxed. Writing is how you get counted, how, Herod takes the census, and so on. Most people historically try to avoid the people who write, the university people. And so from my point of view, it's logical once you no longer have great kings and their stewards who are coming and counting your crops and, counting your laborers and so on. Once you've got that world out of the way and nobody's forcing you to write anymore, nobody's forcing their own writing on you, then it's actually safer not to and easier not to. And there's nothing stopping people telling stories and remembering things. And people remember the most incredible things. So I had this very eye-opening trip to Australia a few years ago, just before COVID. And I'm realizing that one of the benefits of a long history almost entirely without writing over a very big region is that there are enormous numbers of oral histories that have been recorded. And you can tell there are these stories that are told all around the coast of Australia up into the 19th century of flooding, of the land disappearing, of new islands appearing, of very similar stories, all the same kind. And what it is this is the flooding at the end of the Ice Age.
Wow.
I mean, these are people remembering 10,000 years.
Wow.
And the stories they told about it. And they're so consistent and detailed and specific, and they match the science of the kind of geology of these areas and so on. And you get a little bit of this in northern Scotland, actually. But some of the stories that were taken down in the 18th century and early 19th century, but particularly in Australia. So for me, that's the power of not having writing, is that you can have this incredible collective memory. I do realise that we're going to have a problem with our world of post-date book festivals and meetings like this if people give up writing. So I'm not going to recommend it. But I do, though, actually, with ChatGPT now, I think a lot of us in universities are thinking about going back to oral exams. So, yeah, maybe we also have to get better at telling stories.
Joe, this has been fantastic. And I can't wait to read your next book, because the last one is amazing. One of my favourite books of the year. Everyone, Joe Quinn. Thanks, Joe. Such a pleasure.